Now, when we spoke back in April, start of April, I believe it was, you were a little bit pessimistic about whether the West was doing enough to support Ukraine financially. You felt it could have gone further in terms of sanctions on Russia and seizing Russian assets. At that stage, the US Congress hadn't approved the latest package of military aid to Ukraine. Here we are 6 months on. Are you any more optimistic?
Well, in the big picture numbers, not really. As you mentioned, the 61 billion was approved. Obviously, that's helped in the supply of munitions, longer range weaponry to the Ukrainians. The war, though, is still costing about $100 billion a year. That's what we know. There was a effort by the G7 countries to kind of, Trump-proof funding for Ukraine, to want of a better word. There was obviously concern about a Trump victory in November. He's obviously made the point that, or there's been concern, certainly nominee Vice President Vance has suggested that funding for Ukraine should be stopped. So there's this effort to kind of use some of the interest flow on immobilized Russian assets, frozen Russian assets, told the Ukrainians. There's a $50 billion program put together, basically securitizing the long-term interest flow, bringing it forward and giving it the Ukrainians, hopefully before the US presidential elections, before Trump turns up, if he turns up. And that's kind of got stalled. I'm not sure if it was optimism about Harris winning that perhaps made the Americans think that they didn't need it, but we haven't got very much further. And that still leaves the big question, what happens if Trump wins? How's that $100 billion annual financing requirement for Ukraine going to be filled? We've seen nothing really in terms of progress, in terms of accessing the underlying 330 billion of immobilized or frozen Russian assets. That's kind of gone nowhere, been stalled by this 50 billion program. And as I said back in April, in the end, the numbers are so big that there's no other alternative but to use those immobilized Russian assets. It's all a bit disappointing. We have seen one interesting development, which has been there's been an agreement between Ukraine and private creditors to restructure around $23 billion of Ukraine's debts. There's been a write-off, there's been an extension of maturity, there's been agreement on a reduced coupon, and that brings savings of around $12 billion to Ukraine in terms of debt service. But actually, in terms of the bigger scheme of things, as I said, Ukraine has a minimum annual financing requirement of 100 billion. I think it should be 150 billion to win. An 11.8 billion financing contribution, actually, over more or less a 3-year period of the IMF program, doesn't really touch the sides. And I think, unless G7 countries, grab the problem by the scruff of the neck and say, what do we need? What is the cost of funding Ukraine to defend itself and to win? And how are we going to fill it? Then I think in the end, the advantage is with Putin. And I'm afraid, there's not much joined up thinking in terms of how we fund Ukraine. It's all piecemeal. Actually, you could argue it's the same with the military funding of Ukraine, right? It's kind of last minute. It's kind of, lots of countries find reasons not to supply kit. And it's the same with funding. And in the end, needs must. And eventually, after much delay, the Ukrainians kind of get what they need. But we're not thinking 1, 2, 3 years down the road, which we should be.
Yeah, I definitely want to return to what more the West could be doing to help Ukraine financially in a moment. I just wonder, Timothy, whether there is some cause for optimism in terms of whether some of the oligarchs in Russia are starting to feel a bit unsettled by the impact of these sanctions. It was interesting that Oleg Deripaska, who's a Russian oligarch, was quite critical of Putin, surprisingly critical of Putin on a recent visit to Japan, talking about the effect of the sanctions and criticizing the war in Ukraine. Do you think that if he's saying stuff like that, other oligarchs are feeling that way? And do you think the sanctions are starting to be felt by the rich and powerful in Russian society?
Well, there's been a couple of new developments on the sanctions front. One, late last year, the G7 and the Western allies basically sent a very strong signal around secondary sanctions. So, you have the main sanction on Russia, Russian gas or military supplies or whatever it is, banks are specifically sanctioned. But then there are threats of sanctions on entities that facilitate trade with Russia, allow Russia to get around those sanctions. These are called secondary sanctions. And there was a very strong message, I think, sent to third countries, countries that have been helping Russia get around, these restrictions. And the message was, if we see you doing that, we will sanction you direct. Now, this could include Chinese banks, Chinese companies, Middle East entities operating out of Dubai, out of Turkey, out of Kazakhstan, all these places. A very, very strong message was sent. That's one thing. And secondly, a month or so ago, or 2 months ago, MOEX, which is a big foreign exchange brokerage entity, essentially, was specifically sanctioned, and it a lot of the FX transactions that underlie Russia's trade with these third countries went through that exchange, and the fact that it was sanctions meant that a lot of those companies that are trading through Russia didn't really want to conduct the FX transactions through that entity, and now are wondering how they do it, how they can trade with Russia and get paid and do the transaction with an entity that is not going to end up with them sanctioned. And I think the combination of those two things, we've seen, I think, a substantial drop-off in trade by those countries and entities in China, in Turkey, in the Middle East, with Russia. And we saw an impact. The ruble dropped quite significantly initially. There are now multiple ruble trading rates, which typically suggest countries that are having difficulty transacting FX. You normally have multiple exchange rate. That's kind of what we're seeing. And I think perhaps, now it may well be reflected in those comments by oligarchs like Deripaska. Remember, for a couple of years, Russia we had sanctions. We could argue about how aggressive they were or not, but Russia's, in the end, tried to get round them and has been relatively successful in doing that. Perhaps now they're beginning to bite, and perhaps Russian business leaders are getting a bit worried about that. It coincides, obviously, with the Kursk offensive, I think, which was quite a significant moment in this war overall, and it's maybe pushed Russia back on the back foot and made those around Putin, think twice. Interestingly, we had obviously at the weekend the CIA MI6 director had a press briefing, and they made some comments suggesting that the Kursk offensive and perhaps some of these sanctions finally are making Russia's elites think again about the longevity of this war. We don't know. I mean, that's the reality. We don't know particularly what these guys think or girls think inside their administration. Very few have been vocal in criticizing it. We know some of those people that have been vocal and criticized it have been locked up in jail or killed. Obviously the Wagner chief, a case in point there.
When we spoke last in August, it was shortly after Ukraine had launched its incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. Here we are almost a month on. What is your assessment of how the incursion is going now?
Yeah, look, it's disrupting the Russian theater level operations at scale. It has not changed the tactical situation in the east and Donetsk. There's been a lot of smart analysts and a lot of ink written about how, look, the Russians have not pulled their main, best trained, most capable combat units that are currently driving towards the operationally significant town of Pokrovsk. That's not changed. But there are other effects that I think other people are not paying attention to, which is, look, it's caused the Russians to move units from other parts of the theater, which don't pay immediate dividends right now, but they spoil how the Russians would want to use other forces in space and time after the Pokrovsk operation culminates and ultimately concludes, right? The Russians supposedly were preparing to conduct an attack across the international border from Kursk into Sumy. That was one of the reasons attributed for why the Ukrainians conducted this attack. It was a spoiling operation. And then the Russians have pulled forces from currently the low priority areas of the front line, the south, near Zaporizhia and Kherson, but also from the Liman direction and Luhansk Oblast, right? Those are pre-positioned forces that the Russians would like to use for future operations. The Soviets, in their doctrine, they have this concept called the operational art, operativное искусство in Russian. And part of the core tenets of skillful campaign planning is, look, when you fight, you get tired, and then you got to take a pause, you got to rest. Like, that's called culmination. But if you're skillful about how you prearrange your operational groups, your armies, and you skillfully do your campaigns, you fight your campaigns in such a manner that when group one fights and gets tired and culminates naturally, you have in the breach and the lurch waiting a second group that will then get the baton passed to them, and they will continue offensive operations. And while Group 1 rests, the second one continues to fight. What the Russians have done with this Kursk incursion is they've stripped away the elements that constitute Group 2 and Group 3 that the Russian command might have been waiting upon to then employ in coming months. And what we see now is that the Russians have degraded their ability to do that. And so what it is doing is it's actually throwing off not the current plan for the current campaign, but it is indeed throwing off the future campaigns.
That's really interesting. And look, none of us really know what the true objective of the incursion was from a Ukrainian point of view, but a lot of people speculated it was designed to divert troops away from the front line in the east of Ukraine. But even if that hasn't happened so far, you're saying it has still had a significant effect.
That's correct. So, the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrskyi, he gave some statements to CNN last week, and he did state that one of the objectives was to pull Russian forces away from the Pokrovsk direction and put them into Kursk. And so far, and he acknowledged that is not what has happened so far. But there's many objectives, right? There's multiple objectives. Zelensky's talked about what the objectives are. And just because you don't achieve one of your objectives doesn't mean that it's a failed undertaking, or that, objective 2 and 3 and 4 are not being achieved. So let's talk briefly about some of the effects that the operation is indeed achieving. Those are chiefly, like I said, gunking up the campaign space and time and planning for what the Russian, command at the theater level would want to do after the current Pokrovsk campaign culminates. Number 2, it imposes that, resourcing dilemma and strategic planning dilemma on Putin. For 2.5 years, the Kremlin saw this 1,000-kilometer stretch of international border between Belarus and occupied Kharkiv as essentially a safe zone that they don't have to, adequately protect. And the Ukrainians called the Russian bluff. They have now imposed a new planning requirement on Putin. Is he going to actually station tens of thousands of troops to adequately defend an additional 1,000 kilometers of frontage in the theater, which is not a trivial undertaking? That's going to, and if Putin decides that he is indeed going to upfront and put in those resources, then, for Putin to protract this war into year 3 and year 4 and beyond, that's going to decrease his planning assumptions and decrease the resource availability that he has. So I think that's actually quite important. And look, if Putin decides that he's not going to reinforce the international border, then in some regards, that's even better, because then it gives the Ukrainians opportunities to further embarrass Russia, widen the salient that's currently in Kursk, and create new ones in other parts of the international border.
And what about the situation, George, in Kursk Oblast itself at the moment? How well have Ukraine been able to hold on to the territory they've captured? To what extent have Russia been able to push back?
Every single day, we're studying in minute detail how the contours of the Ukrainian front line is changing, and it ebbs and flows. The rate of advance for the Ukrainians definitely has slowed over the last month, especially in the last 2 weeks. And when we collect geolocated data and other parts of information, we see that the Russians have succeeded in taking back very small pieces of territory on the periphery, and territory continues to change hands. So it seems to be consolidating, it seems to be stabilizing. I think net the Ukrainian gains are still slowly going up there, but it's actually become a lot less interesting. And I suspect that we're actually not going to see a drastic change in the size of the salient, barring either belligerent deploying a significant large amount of forces. The Ukrainians have some brigades in a reserve that they've not yet committed. It remains a question where the Ukrainian command will use them. Will they use them to reinforce Donetsk and the Donbass and Pokrovsk, or will they send them to Kursk to do something there? We don't know. The Russian response, as for them, they've decided to not, massively introduce reserve forces into Kursk. They've deployed, the estimates vary from 20 to 30,000, perhaps a little bit higher number of forces. But the U.S. intelligence community assesses that in order to remove the current salient that the Ukrainians have, the Russians need 50,000 forces. And the Russians, by all indicators, have not sent that. I mean, they've sent maybe half of that. So they've sent enough to stabilize it, slow the Ukrainian advance, and maybe tactically retake a couple villages here or there in the periphery, but not remove it. And what we know is that, look, the Russians, they really don't want to tap into the main combat force that they have in Pokrovsk. Just to give it a sense of scale, right now the Russians in the direction of Pokrovsk, they have at least 2 combined arms army, maybe 3 combined arms armies to conduct this major operation. There's the 41st Combined Arms Army, which is sort of the main element. That's from the Central Military District in Siberia. And then you have the Donetsk People's Republic proxy forces, which were just recently reorganized. They had been called since 2014, the Donetsk, First Army Corps. That recently was reorganized into another Combined Arms Army. It's now called the 51st Combined Arms Army. And then there's a third Combined Arms Army, which is operating in the area as well, the third. And so when you think of the scale, right, and none of these Russian armies are actually up to their doctrinal end strength. A Russian Combined Arms Army, generally speaking, is about 50,000 people on paper, depending on its composition and what kind of units it's staffed with. But on paper, these are organizations that have 50,000 people, right? I'm confident that it's lower than that because all of these Russian units are operating below their doctrinal end strength. But this is a tremendously large amount of combat power. 2 combined arms armies, 3 combined arms armies to put behind a town with a population of, a pre-war population of, 60 or 70,000 people. And if you look at how the Russians have advanced in the direction of Pokrovsk since the beginning of this year, or even from the front lines as it existed from 2014, what the Russians started with in 2022, with 3 combined arms armies and, now 9 months of campaigning this year, they've managed to advance, in total some, 30, 35 kilometers or so from where the initial Russian line was near Avdiivka. That's not terribly great performance. And we know the Russians are isolating those armies and trying really hard to not send anything from there to the Kursk group. So that seems to be the decision that the Kremlin has leaned into for now. And I'm pretty confident that unless the Russians make a major decision, mobilize a lot of forces, deploy a large group, substantially re-engineer the way that they're currently fighting the fight at the theater level, I think that Ukrainian salient will likely survive through the winter.
Putin does clearly have concerns because thus far they have avoided this general mobilization that would mean that young men from Moscow and St. Petersburg would be drafted, would be brought into the military. And my sense is that for the last few years, they have avoided doing that because obviously it will be difficult to hide the reality of the war when you've got funerals going through the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which will surely happen if you have a bunch of soldiers that come from these cities. So there is some concern about impact on the Russian population by the direction of the war.
And is President Putin and his military leaders feeling pressure to deliver some kind of progress, some kind of result before the winter in the Donbass?
This is a classic political thing to say, I want this done by this date, whether it's from a democratic country or a dictator, because you are conscious of having to deliver something to show that it's worthwhile. And so these thousands of people are going to die because of a desire by the Kremlin to capture this destroyed town of Pokrovsk that has been mistakenly referred to as strategically important when it's not strategically important. The Ukrainians have already quit using it. They're only defending in front of it to bleed out as the Russians as much as they can.
You've spoken before about the need for a coherent US strategy towards the war in Ukraine. Antony Blinken, David Lammy in Kyiv, meeting Zelensky, the British Prime Minister due to meet President Biden, President Zelensky delivering his victory plan. It does feel like a critical time at the moment. Is that a growing will to supply Ukraine with everything it needs to win the war? Is that will growing and to win it on its own terms? Or do you think it is just to get in a good position for negotiations?
I honestly don't know. We're in a weird place right now. President Biden, we're come just a few months away from the end of his term as president of the United States. If Vice President Harris becomes our president, she would most likely continue on generally the same arc, although I imagine that she would be more proactive because this will be at the front end of her time, and we'll be thinking, how do we with our allies organize for victory in the longer term, dealing with Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and China? But at least it won't get worse or weaker. If it's a Trump administration, I'd be very concerned about what comes next. But I am uneasy that there is so much talk and there's so much influence by people back in Washington that have been clamoring, saying that there's no way Ukraine can win. Come on, we need to get to a negotiation. And I'm like, can you look at a map? How can you say that there's no way Ukraine can win, that after 10 and a half years, Russia controls only 18% of Ukraine? They've lost 600,000 troops. The Black Sea Fleet, no longer a factor. The Russian Air Force has failed its two most important tasks. If we got serious about winning, we would have already stopped Russia from being able to export oil through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea to China and India. No Iranian missiles would ever reach Russia. So if we were serious about those things, we'd be having a whole different conversation. So I am uneasy that there still are too many voices that say we need to get to a resolution soon, and that usually means force Ukraine or try to pressure Ukraine to give up Crimea.
You speaking to us from Germany, and the German Chancellor has called for a renewed effort to bring peace to Ukraine. He wants the next, and he says he and Zelensky agree that they want the next peace conference to involve Russia. What has to happen for that to even be on the cards?
Well, the Russians, excuse me, this war is never going to end until Putin realizes he cannot win. And as long as he thinks that the West is prepared to abandon Ukraine or undermine Ukrainian efforts to win and will stop short of helping Ukraine restore its sovereignty, then he will keep going. So peace talks involving Russia, okay, fine. But if the Russians show up and they have no intention of ever living up to some kind of long-term, no kidding, enforceable agreement, then this will be about as valuable as this ridiculous Minsk process was. And my confidence that Putin and the Russians would ever live up to any agreement is very, very low.
You're in a quite a good position to be able to see the conflict from different perspectives, given that you spend time in the US, you are an American, but you live in Germany, and you've had the role, as I spoke, Commander US Army Europe. What is the mood within Germany? Because right now, Olaf Scholz has intense domestic political pressure on himself. His centre-left coalition suffered significant losses in regional state elections. What are people in Germany saying about the war in Ukraine? Can Ukraine depend on Germany and rely on Germany?
I think that by and large, yes, that Germany will continue to deliver capabilities that Ukraine needs. But you are 100% correct that the current government is fragile. It's a coalition government with three different parties. Um, the main opposition party, of course, the Christian Democrats, are a much stronger supporter of Ukraine. The Greens, interestingly, are one of the most hawkish parties in Germany, pro-Ukraine. But the Bundeskanzler himself, Mr. Scholz, is just, I think he's really struggling personally and with the left side of his party, the SPD, on what to do here. I mean, he's having to overcome decades of I don't want to say pacifism, but an unwillingness to hold Russia accountable in a meaningful way. And then, of course, the recent elections in Saxon and Thuringia, where you had AfD and also this Sarah Wagenknecht party, both of which are anti-Ukraine, pro-Russian, in the war now, and that's on the rise, directly in response to immigration issues. And of course, that's not a coincidence. Most of what Russia does is intended to force, to weaponize migrants, whether they come from Syria or from Ukraine or other parts of the world. So it's a long, rambling answer. I apologize, but
It's good.
I do think that the Germans will continue there's still across most of the population a recognition that Ukraine needs to be supported, and they also know that if Ukraine fails, there'll be another 5 or 6 million Ukrainian refugees that will be headed to Germany.
The 24th Ukraine Contact Group meeting in Ramstein recently concluded. Coalition of more than 50 countries to coordinate support for Ukraine. It flagged up the need to invest in Ukraine's defence industrial base, to help ramp up its own production, as well as provide equipment more quickly to it. How much progress do you think there has been with this group, and what are the challenges?
Well, it's been an important structure for building consensus, for actually delivering capabilities. It's amazing. I'm sure the Kremlin never imagined that there would be 50 countries still at this point united in delivering different types of capabilities to the Ukrainian side. So that's important in and of itself. But by itself, that's not going to win the war. I think the move towards helping Ukraine redevelop its own defense industry is an important step. And so, as more and more countries feel confident about allowing their companies to set up shop inside Ukraine, whether it's for maintenance or production or various other functions, I think this is a positive thing. You know, some people my age will remember that Ukraine was the heart of the defense industry of the Soviet Union. So there is a kind of a residual engineering expertise, IT expertise that's there. They know how to make stuff, and so I feel pretty optimistic that despite what Russia is doing, that Ukraine will continue to grow its capability. You know, I live here in Frankfurt, and the memories of the Allies bombing the hell out of this city during the war are everywhere. But German aircraft production actually increased through the year 1944. It was higher at the end of 44 than it was at the beginning of 44, despite the zillions of bombs that were dropped by the U.S. Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force.
Kamala Harris, the Vice President, and former President Donald Trump have been clashing in the first and, at the moment, appears to be the only US presidential debate of this election. Foreign policy did play quite a key part. What was your analysis of what we saw?
Well, it was bizarre. We expected it to be bizarre, and of course, it was bizarre. Any debate with Trump always is. But obviously, I was most interested in the Ukraine aspects, and it was quite clear that both of them, but particularly Trump, was clearly speaking with the election in mind. So yet again, he came up with this improbable notion that he will solve the Ukraine war between being elected and taking up office. So that's sort of between November and January, which of course is nonsense because he won't be president until January. So to an extent, we can discount quite a bit of what he says. When Boris Johnson saw Trump a couple of months ago, he emerged from the meeting saying he thought that Trump would actually be much more responsible on Ukraine than he's saying. But I mean, I think everybody, Putin, Zelensky, everybody is worrying about the election. And I think it's really having a deep effect on the situation on the ground. For example, I don't think the Kursk offensive would have happened had it not been for the forthcoming election. So Zelensky is preparing for the possibility, and it's only a possibility, that the winter period, the winter break, November 24 to April 25, might actually see a peace negotiation. So, they're scrambling for advantage. Ditto, Putin would like to take Pokrovsk before November. So this is what we're seeing on the ground. And now, I think most people who hope that Kamala Harris wins, think, well, if Kamala Harris wins, it will be business as usual. I'm not actually convinced about that. I think there is a half-hearted nature about the US support for this war. I mean, that sounds, in many ways, it sounds very ungrateful. I mean, they've given vast amounts of money and vast amounts of support. We must bear that in mind. But I mean, there are aspects of the war where Biden, is not completely full-throated in his support. So there's the question, obviously, of using the missiles on Russian territory. I think and suspect that on Friday this week, that will be resolved. and that there will be an announcement saying that they can, and that, of course, will be a response to the Iranian provision of 200 ballistic missiles to Russia. So in many ways, that is good news. But I think if you look right back to February 2022, United States has been a little bit slow in provision of stuff. I mean, too little, too late, often. And the one that worries me most of all these things, and I hope we can talk about a bit more, is the question of NATO membership for Ukraine. So, if you look back and think to yourself, well, how can Ukraine win this war? It seems to me there are only two things that can happen. Ukraine can either retake territory, so it can retake Donbass and retake Crimea. And quite honestly, I think that is vanishingly unlikely. They gave it a good shot with the counteroffensive in 2023. It wasn't successful. They've done some very, very good operations in Ukraine, don't get me wrong, and they've fought valiantly in the Donbass. But yard by yard, meter by meter, Russia is making advances in the Donbass. And Ukraine realistically is not going to get the Donbass or Ukraine back, unless, of course, something dramatic happens, like the Russian army mutinies. But you cannot base a policy on the hope that the Russian army mutinies. It might not. It probably won't. But they suffer tremendous casualties, and the conditions are appalling. But nonetheless, if you look back at Russia's history, Russian armies tend not to mutiny, although they have done. The other way Ukraine can claim a win is by getting EU and NATO membership. Now, a situation at the end of the war in which they neither get their territory back nor get EU and NATO membership would be an absolute catastrophe. And I think that is what we all need to turn our minds to now, the end game. And I'm not saying we take our foot off the pedal. I'm not saying that we reduce the war effort. Obviously, we must keep up the war effort. But we must start doing some basic work on, A, what happens if Trump wins, and B, how are we going to deal with a NATO application if Hungary and maybe even Slovakia oppose it? And, it means that the EU and NATO are going to have to grip some of these really difficult problems. Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia. And, I'm not seeing any evidence of if you like, work off the ball, to resolve any of these issues. Add to that other areas where Russia can make real gains. Now, the two that really worry me are Georgia, where there's a election coming up in October, but already, there's every sign that Russia is making gains in Georgia, thanks to the oligarch Ivanishvili, who is making great headway. So even though 80% or 79%, I think it is, of Georgians want to join the EU, gradually the Russians are tightening their grip on Georgia. And the other one is Moldova. Again, there are important elections in Moldova in October. There's every sign that Russia's up to its usual hybrid warfare techniques, fake information, all the usual stuff in Moldova. And I'm not seeing enough sign that the West is taking Georgia and Moldova seriously enough. And it all speaks to this general thing that for Putin, the Ukraine war is number one, number two, number three, number four priorities. And for the West, it's somewhere about number seven, after the economy, after health provision, after education, after cost of living. We do not invest the same degree of focus and attention in Ukraine as Russia does. And I think that's very concerning.
They're actually genuinely concerned about that versus they hide behind fears of escalation as sort of the rhetorical justification for other reasons is unclear to me. And I really don't know. I've spoken with policymakers who have been actually genuinely concerned about the risk of, catastrophic horrors, vertical escalation in Ukraine, like the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon or something, which is very unlikely, or, the Russians escalating horizontally and then saying, all right, look, American and NATO intelligence support and facilitate these attacks through collection and targeting support for the Ukrainian military, making them de facto parties to the conflict. and therefore we're going to start retaliating by striking, NATO, right? Like that's another kind of escalation that we want to avoid, that we're concerned about as well. And I don't know which is which, or to what extent the policymakers are grappled by that. Another reason has to do with the bureaucratic politics within the Pentagon. Whenever we want to pull away resources from one stockpile, right, those are in principle earmarked for contingency plans for different combatant commands, for different commanders, and you decrease American readiness when you send these weapons. I would argue that, look, it's better to use weapons that we pay for and have an inventory for the real war that has serious implications for NATO and American interests, as opposed to, say, the hypothetical war that might occur but is not happening now, and would more likely happen if the adversary is perceived that the United States will not treat current wars seriously, and you can indeed bully them and get them to not be decisive about defeating current wars. So it's a combination of these factors, and I wish I could tell you, but we continue to boil the frog. We continue to make the right decision, sort of a day late and a dollar short. And I hope that we will do the right thing vis-a-vis JASMs and eventually ATACMs, because the Ukrainians need that capability.
Just wanted to ask you, George, about something that the ISW mentions in your latest Russian offensive campaign assessment, which is how the Kremlin has been leveraging the weekend's Russian regional elections to try and get veterans of the war in Ukraine into leadership positions in Russia. And partly you say that's because of concerns the Kremlin may have about domestic support for the war. I mean, a lot of people have focused on that since the incursion into Kursk. How big an issue do you think that is for Putin, that he's worried about how the war is perceived internally?
Putin was a KGB officer in the late Soviet period, in the late 80s, when Glasnost and Perestroika were going on, and there was more political freedom, more freedom of thought and exchange. And it was actually some of those reforms that Gorbachev undertook. Gorbachev didn't want to blow up or destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to have a reformation to make Soviet communism essentially work better. But that dose of more political freedom, political organization, freedom of information proved lethal, because you started to have people questioning the government myths, questioning throughout the legacy of the Soviet Union, the narrative that the state was putting out there, the history of the state, just abusing the population. And then also, with the war in Afghanistan, with a whole bunch of, killed Russians over the course of a decade in a foreign war that was not going well, the mothers of killed service members started to actually create, civil society organizations and hold demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations and that sort of thing. And the Soviet police state was not willing to crack down upon that. So Putin's very alive to the fact that, look, when you have a cleavage of society, of which Russian veterans are going to become a sizable portion, especially not just veterans that, sort of served, did their time, got out. We're talking about veterans that are wounded, many of whom who have serious life-altering injuries, like missing a limb or permanently crippled, right? They no longer fight. When you return those people to society, and now they have to rely on a support system of the state and their community and their families, you can this has essentially created a new political cleavage within Russia, which is a liability for the Kremlin, especially in the long term, and especially if among these people, there becomes a prevalent idea of, like, why the hell are we fighting this war in Ukraine, into the third year, into the fourth year, into the fifth year, if we're not achieving our objectives, right? And so I think what the Kremlin's doing is they've launched a clear campaign. It's called the Times of Heroes Initiative, where they essentially are trying to incorporate Russian veterans into political life. They're trying to get them involved in governance at the local level, at the federal level. They're trying to get them involved in, hearing complaints of the community, from shaping government policies. And this gives this new political cleavage, some degree of agency in policy making. It helps them feel that they're not being ignored or isolated by the state. It actually brings them into the fold and gives them some privileges and powers, both political and monetary, right? And what that does is essentially it co-opts this cleavage so that it actually becomes a reinforcing arm of the state, as opposed to a potential liability that could help turn the tide against the current state policy. So it's very intelligent, it's very smart, and it's helping Putin, protract this war effort for as long as he wants to.
But it's also fascinating how clearly Putin is worried about making too much of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. He wants to play it down almost. And you point out that the Russian regional elections would have been the perfect moment to get rid of the current acting governor of Kursk Oblast, but he doesn't want to do that because that would draw attention to what's happening in Kursk.
Exactly. Yeah. So on our update that we published yesterday on September 9, the incumbent governor won. He'll be serving there for another 5 years, so he's avoided a potential outing for now. But it seems the Kremlin political strategy and messaging strategy here is to sort of portray the Kursk incursion as the new normal, to get people used to it, to acclimate them to it, to not have them think and panic over it, because the Russians genuinely can't really do anything about it, as we discussed, in terms of their means. And it was very interesting. There was a lot of messaging from the Russians yesterday saying, look, voter turnout in Kursk was very, very high. Everything's basically hunky-dory. We were able to conduct our political processes like normal, and all's good and well. And the governor's been reelected, and sort of the political Potemkin village equivalent of what Catherine the Great would do back in the day. So this is a further indication that, look, you can indeed push back on the Russians. They're actually quite bad at crisis management and preparing for unplanned contingencies, and they sort of sheepishly ad-lib their way through it and then accept the costs and the embarrassments that we impose on them, sort of with their tail tucked between their legs, and they don't lash out, and they don't escalate vertically or horizontally in a crazy way.
And I should say, for anyone who's interested, the ISW's Russian offensive campaign assessments every day are essential reading if you're interested in finding out more. George, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always good to see you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.